So we have
Looks like you're about to start
until
some commercials.
2:55. Is that still the plan?
I believe so.
Okay. I didn't
Yep.
know when you guys actually started.
We started a
Ready to
couple
go.
minutes late, I think.
Okay.
But
Cool.
where's the
Wait, so it's two. Would you like me to track time and this time have a new strategy?
Actually check time.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
that's what I'm adding from the.
More, it was just kind of helping if my role as facilitator, if we have ideas for topics that we want to do, then we can like make sure we hit them. So maybe,
I have some questions.
cool. So what I was thinking we could do to kind of start off is if we say like, the topic is identity in the indie web, what are some things that people think they might want to talk about? I can write those down and then we can see which ones we can cover until 2:55 and then we can save the rest for the rest of our lives to talk about.
Sorry, real quick. What was your name again?
Russell.
Russell. Just putting you down as.
Okay.
All right, no. Now,
That's a weird choice.
It's
That's a weird choice for the time's up alarm, but I like it.
yes, it's meant to be. Wait, the app is.
It just keeps getting better, man. The gift that keeps giving.
Where is it playing?
I
This
think
is
it's
kind
on your
of.
phone.
Trying to swipe the cover sheet down,
Yeah, you're right.
and then
Sorry, but see, that's not it. Oh, weird.
Camp workshops how to
Okay.
turn music off.
Yes, how to help Matt over his phone.
I'm not gonna do the timing anymore, and
Cool. I have
This
a
is,
clock on my
I can-
computer. I can take that
what
responsibility.
the hell? Okay.
Yeah.
Just 2 seconds
Yeah.
into that alarm going off, I had shut down the clock tool. I just want to say that was not an expected experience.
That's impressive. All right, so let's take a minute or two. And so, the topic that we've all decided we wanted to sit around a table and chat about is identity and the indie web. And I think it would be valuable to kind of catalog what are some things that might remind us of, or things that we've been thinking about that might be valuable to chat about. I can write those down, like I said, and then we can kick off a discussion, and I'll monitor time and kind of transition between some of those topics. So we don't have to go around in a circle. If you have no ideas, totally fine, no pressure. Does anybody want to kick off this list or idea? What would be on this list?
One of the most common uses in IndieWeb, at least, is like your domain is your identity online.
Mm-hmm. Like the domain name, like
Yeah,
the
the
actual
domain
letters.
name,
Okay.
right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
And for a lot of us, that's I guess that's a basic.
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
But there maybe a sub issue is like for a lot of us that is just our name,
Mm-hmm.
but for some people they might want to be more private or pseudonymous or totally anonymous.
Yeah.
I
Great.
have a much broader question.
Mm-hmm.
Who am I?
Great question. And can the IndieWeb tell me?
Well, part of that
How
is
do I
can the
figure it
IndieWeb
out?
tell me, or how do I tell the IndieWeb?
That's awesome.
It goes both ways.
Yeah, definitely. What are other people's thoughts?
I think about style and what's your theme or what
Mm-hmm.
how do you present yourself on the web?
Mm-hmm. I'm actually going to split those and how do you present yourself on the web, I think is a really interesting topic for even more discussion. So I can see it as both the graphic design and the
Yeah.
layout, but then kind of how do I present me on the web? Other thoughts?
You brought up earlier, it was really interesting, when we were talking about the sessions of protecting or making sure you're only sharing what you're comfortable with. And that's a really interesting topic too.
Mm-hmm. I think with so many of these kind of complicated topics, intersectionality is where it gets really interesting. And so, what happens if I have multiple identities? Do I have multiple domain names? Do I have multiple styles? How do I resolve any
That was
of
the
those?
first question I asked in this community. actually.
Yeah. Okay.
Is who I am different in one community versus another community versus one context versus another context.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things about like the IndieWeb, like putting a specific identity. I'm really curious about that question. Anyway, I don't have something to contribute. I think that's
Yeah.
really.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, so we have like 6, which is of course way more than we can talk about until 2:55. So we could start there if that was a place that people immediately felt like they had thoughts or responses to. Matt, I don't know if you wanted to continue your thought or if you were starting a thought. I couldn't.
Oh,
quite
because
tell.
I didn't even have a full idea there.
You were
I agree.
Just like plus one.
It was a little bit, but so I mean, there are of course a bunch of different ways to approach this one. But one thing that I was thinking was really interesting is that you know, a lot of people are using IndieWeb as an opportunity to, you know, put themselves on the web and in a sort of clearly broadcast their identity, you know, as they shape it, and be able to own that and have, you know, the control down the line to tune it and tweak it, which means from a certain perspective it's not just well, I mean, you might get a more clear expression than if you have to try to put that picture together from going to all these various silos and saying, well, you know, I see this little bit on Facebook and this little bit there, and so I'm getting a sense of them. And this, so the kind of like the, you know, your domain ends up being a statement of who you are. But we all play so many different roles.
Is
It's
Facebook Match the same as?
yeah. Yeah, well, it's like when you play in a silo, one advantage is that is that you're in a context and you can see the behaviors of others there, and be tuning and adjusting based on that. But if you are broadcasting who you are, you get to establish what that is. But you're also putting yourself on the web, which in a certain sense removes the context. Though if people are finding you through the community of IndieWeb, that's not true. I mean, they have that additional context. So I'm wondering if it ends up being viable to really authentically present yourself on the web in multiple places, and those put multiple personalities up there. That's valuable, actually. I don't mean just like separating identities for security, but also for expression. You asked me to give you more.
Yeah,
That's what I got.
Right. So can like MattGriffin.com have Matt the this and Matt the
Right.
this and right? Can all of that exist there, or does it need to be separately siloed and completely? Yeah.
That's one thing that I love about my domain name. It's like dark.is. I could say like dark.is / a maker, dark.is / an educator, something like that. You know.
But do you deliver landing pages experience like that to people?
Right now I just have my blog and like my maker. The link to my maker, like the maker part, just links to like my dev profile. But yeah, I in the future I plan to like expand that idea and like make different types of pages with different types of styles too, with that domain name.
That's really interesting because that's like you're still having it through a single expression of your domain, like you were
Jonathan is, and I am a little bit.
like you were saying.
I don't have
But then also it's like you have a little bit of that. Like you can tailor the /educator a little bit differently than the /a maker or whatever. Like that's a pretty cool concept. Yeah.
I like it. Would you have like the exchange board? Is the root level site that doesn't have the? You
Yeah,
haven't
like-
established what it is. Do you want somebody to have a snapshot of saying that there are these multiple cells?
Not necessarily. Like there could be like secret ones that I don't want anybody to know about, you know, or like I want only a few people to know about.
That's
I
cool.
was almost imagining if you could have ways as you're seeing who people are coming to your site, then that can be presenting or foregrounding the certain things that you care for. People from, you know, professional, looking at your site through a company, or looking through university, or looking through whatever. Maybe it's specific to what country their traffic's coming from. If they're using an Onion browser, that might be a cue that there's something that like you want to really put out in front of them.
Well, what do you show them if you're not sure?
It's an
Right.
excellent question.
That is a great question.
Yeah.
Questionnaire.
Yeah.
Who are you?
Who are you?
Like a quiz.
Right.
What kind of donut are you?
Are you the FBI?
Right.
You have to say yes.
Right. I think that's really fascinating. I think it was really getting to, I see a really direct connection to Gregor's point about if your domain name is your identity. And particularly what happens with legacy systems, right? Where we've now had this domain, people have been going to it, everyone's subscribed to it in all their systems, they've set up their micropubs and all of the stuff to Bridgie, but then something changes, right? And so, I mean, it's kind of a challenge. You see a lot of people who transition with identity is then you have like these dead names or these legacy identities, and how do you even resolve that?
Yeah.
And is that something that we should be thinking about? Right? And it's even as simple as like the screen name problem, where like, yeah, I don't want to be Rabbit Girl 29 when I'm 50. Right? That might
Right.
be appropriate at a certain period of my life too.
Were you Rabbit Girl?
No, I made that up. Completely. But I mean, I have had like plenty of stupid names that for usernames that then were really important, and I couldn't undo them easily.
Right.
Right, and you don't want
It's available
to
on Twitter.
flip a Boolean
Still hope.
identifier and have that be announced necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even with domains, like it's relatively easy to switch them. I mean, if you want to move away from it and you don't mind paying for the old one, you can always redirect it. But even if you wanted to like remove content, unless you're very diligent with like blocking like the Internet Archive or something, even then, like you could remove stuff and it's still on the internet. You know, I know in Europe there's different laws about that. I think they have a right to be forgotten before you're 18 or something like that.
You forgot the name of the right to be forgotten.
Yes.
Okay, I just. No.
That's kind of a whole other can of worms, but it is a concern, for changing identities.
And it happens, right? Or maybe like I then split out, and then I'm like, okay, for people that we're having all these interactions with, Aaron checking me in through whatever it is that's not Foursquare. It's like, I don't want that actually to be my name, I want that to be this identity, right?
Right.
And so it's like he sets it up one way, and then I have to correct him, and just kind of like, I think building in the tools for flexibility and changes in identity. Because then Aaron might be like, well, come on, I already entered you in, like, I don't really want to change it. And so it's like, how do you even get other people to respect that and that that's important to you?
Yeah.
And some of that does get into some of the topics you guys are thinking about with like leaking data too. Like, I would hate if Aaron was tagging me in like the Foursquare apps and Swarm and all that, because like I hate having my location be broadcast
Right.
everywhere, and yet like I totally cannot control that.
Yeah.
If he's setting it all up, like it's easy for me in Foursquare because I'm like, well, I just don't have a Foursquare account. But if he's set it up to post, like, does he need my permission really? Like, is he just going to do that?
I do think like the default setting. I think the default setting with Swarm is when you're friends with somebody, you can check them in, unless you specifically go in and say no, you can't check me in, which is not something I like myself. You know, so I have that feature off. But most people probably don't know that.
Yeah. I mean, some of that may be bridging more privacy than identity topics.
Well, last month he checked me in all around Austin.
It's interesting because I think it comes from two different angles, right? There's the socialization aspect, right? Like how you're interacting with people, and then there's the technological aspect. Of course, the technological aspect can never fix everything, right? But I think it's good to remember, like, in lots of cases, like, IndieWeb stuff has moved forward, but when I was looking on the tag page the other day, it even talked about, like, it had been floated, what if you tag someone and it sends a notification and then they can accept or reject that? And so there are some thoughts on that, but interestingly, we haven't pushed those areas as far forward as we might have some other areas. And so that's interesting, right, that there could be some helpful technological solutions where it's like, I could be checked in anywhere, but it's going to ping me, and I can say yes or no to each instance.
Well, I think there's a reason for that. This community particularly happens to be a very open group of people, so
We
not
do.
being open has not been a high priority for
That's
people
true.
who share everything as part of.
Yeah, definitely.
But
So,
then there's
yeah.
that barrier of, oh, well, if you care about moving off the silos, you have to be part of this really open community of people who are cool
Sure, yeah.
posting these things, and if not, then sorry, you can't play,
Exactly.
right, which is very problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've definitely seen criticism in the past from some marginalized people who are like, "This sounds great, but I'm in a locked Twitter account, and I'm not ready to just go public, because they're gonna just still get harassment and stuff."
Yeah.
You can have a private EU website. Boring. It's doable.
Well, that's an interesting question. Like, is participating in IndieWeb? It almost everything I've seen always assumes that you're that you're participating online. I wonder if there is like a continuation into offline that matches the ethos. I mean,
How would you describe that?
that
What is
you
the offline
benefit
equivalent
from
of the
some of
IndieWeb?
the recommended standards, approaches, and best practices, but what you're doing is not broadcast, or is only broadcast locally or within a gated
Yeah.
area.
So private posts.
There's been some work in that area,
Yeah.
but not heavily.
Not
Yeah.
And a lot of it's more of like experimentation by
Yeah.
people who are public. Like Aaron and Raya really are pretty public, and we experiment with stuff like that. But I don't know if we're using it widely.
But does that there's an interesting identity implication there. So is your IndieWeb identity only the parts of you that can participate in online public discussions? Maybe.
I think the main thing with IndieWeb is basically URLs that you control. So
Right.
the visibility of that, it could be just for you. You could share it with a set of people, whether it's by password or some other authentication mechanism. Like Facebook, you can share a post that's with one person.
That's important.
So maybe more people should try that. So there's been experiments. Maybe
Yeah.
we need more experiments.
Yeah.
Or building in more tools that then make that easier and kind of defining groups. There might even be a challenge, like with IndieWeb, it's too individual, right? And like, is the next generation more about something that ties, okay, this is a group, a cluster that's easily able to interact and share. This is another kind of network system.
Node is a popular CMS.
Yeah.
Probably a lot of you are familiar with. Like, it would be great if there was like, I don't know, semi-private or private Node. Like you can set it up and add friends, and then just be very specific with who you're sharing with, and there's no question about it. I know that's a criticism even with Facebook. It's like the privacy controls change all the time, and it's like, who am I sharing this with?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which I think is so much the attraction
Mhm.
of moving to doing it on your own, is that you could have more control.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question because I could see there being like, there's interest from somebody who would want to move off Facebook or off Twitter, but like wanting the tools or the protections or whatever need to be easily accessible enough that it's like, okay, I don't have to choose between sacrificing my safety to be indie or IndieWeb. Right? I think that's like a really interesting question. Yeah.
Usability is going to be important too.
Right,
We
exactly.
can't expect them to be like programmers and all this.
Yeah.
I think this might be a weird thing to say, but I feel that particularly this crew with some of the experiments with things like sharing your current battery life on your phone, which I just think is fantastic.
I'm
I wonder if
waiting for
there's
the use case for that. I have
right.
one.
Well, no, I tell you, the use case that occurs to me is like, if it's dead and you call him and he doesn't pick up, you're like, oh, okay, maybe he doesn't not like me.
That was
That's
one
a
of
good
the-
point.
That would work, right?
that was
good
one of the
point.
ones when I asked.
Right,
The other one was somebody may want to offer you a charger.
Yeah.
right. But but as opposed to folks who are like the people who are like all like just data junkies, of like all the the tracker, like where the focus is on having your data, seeing your data move. That's what you're getting stimulated by.
Quantified self, that sort of thing.
Quantified self stuff. Yeah, I feel like this community is doing things like that, but I wonder if there's like also an element, like some of these practices, they're not just like kind of cool and useful. That some of them seem to be like really good ways that maybe a lot of people might like to do things with computers, not even just publishing. So I wonder if the like digital legacy aspect of identity is kind of an interesting one. That people participating are capturing all kinds of stuff, like you're capturing like altitude, like information at altitude, just for the hell of it. But like what are you gonna do with it? Maybe you'll do something interesting with
Just
it.
because I think I might do something.
Well, there you go. So you're collecting it, and so I mean, eventually, isn't that kind of a portrait of who you are? That you have that.
Well, there's a solution. When I'm no longer here, my website will just talk for me.
Chris Aldrich, who's with us remotely, has dropped in several links to wiki pages that'll be helpful. There's like audience, multi-site IndieWeb, private profile, private posts, and commonplace book.
Ooh.
I don't know what that one is.
Nice. Commonplace books when you write down quotes and stuff as you're reading.
Okay.
It was a Victorian practice, but it's now like people interpret that. I want to read this. Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, what was that called?
Commonplace
Commonplace
book.
book.
I'm gonna look up that one too.
It's in
I don't
our.
think
It'll
I've
be
read-
on the wiki when
I
we
don't think
archive
I've read
these
that
notes.
page on the wiki. Let's see what it actually says. Let's see what the official wiki definition is.
Yeah.
A way to compile and store knowledge, usually by writing information, books, notebooks, card catalogs, or in a more modern setting on one's own website.
Awesome.
I've talked to Marty a little bit about, like, we've had some discussions about that last part that you were saying, like the digital legacy aspect of that. It's like you can, if you collect all of that, then you can kind of see like your identity at like an intersection of time, right? Like your activities or whatever you're logging could be totally different. You could have been a totally different person or done different things, and you have like an archive of that. Like that's a pretty interesting concept to think about. Like if you have all of that, it's there. But then the question is like, well, what if you want to collect that and archive it, but you don't want it to be publicly broadcast to everybody?
Yeah.
Like I think that's like an important
So like the
question with
practice
that.
matches with the other things you're doing, but that stream is not one that you necessarily want to share.
Exactly, but you still want it. Yeah.
But it's still your website, even if you don't share it with other people.
Right, yeah, and maybe there's aspects of it you do want to share, some of it you don't. Yeah.
That does lead me to a tangential question. Has anybody ever basically retroactively posted something?
Yeah.
I'm not talking about, well, no, I'm not talking about, let's say, a day or two afterwards. I'm talking about years afterwards.
Yeah. I'm actually in the practice right now. I'm trying to go back and like document all the concerts I've been.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if you go back to mine, the oldest post on my website dates from my date of birth.
Excellent. Well,
Somebody gave me that
What happened
idea.
that day?
but have
You'll have to go check
Okay.
my website, 'cause there is a page
Oh,
for
no, I
it.
didn't mean
are
that.
there examples of people
I
who
think I put my
are
birth weight on it.
essentially just examining their life and posting like the structuring post date is when something happened?
Yep.
And like none of them are done, like you're not using it for chronological posting? You said there are some.
I started actually doing that a little bit. So one thing I
Cool.
started doing with it was when I switched over my site from Hugo to WordPress, I was like, well, I have a bunch of stuff in the last like year I still want somewhere. So I was like going and changing the post dates to like when it was originally, and then I was like this, and I just put a little note at the top. But then I had the idea of like, well, I have tons of like notebooks and journals. It's like, well, I could do the same thing with that, and then it's like there would be, because I love the idea of having a hub on my site that's like a collection of all of my thoughts, but it's
Yep.
like a bunch of them are notebooks. So that concept, like, I'm gonna archive it. Like
love
that's
that.
a cool
I
idea.
started
Yeah.
doing a 1999 trip report that I keeping it in a notebook. I got through 2 days and I still have 4 to do, and it's been a year and a half since I last put one on. But the notebook was before digital photography became popular, where
Yeah.
I kept the log of all of the photos I took and what they were of.
That's cool.
and I have the photos, so I kept trying to basically over what now?
Well-
nearly 20 years later, trying to remember what.
Now, are you when you're putting this together? Are you writing? Are you creating the piece that you're sharing? Are you writing it in terms of like as if you were writing it then, or are you writing it with
Both.
the perspective? Okay.
Basically, I have the editorial comment
Right.
on as if I was editing the original words. So the original words are in one font. My commentary about what I'm remembering years later is in a different font.
That's cool.
That
So
is
you can
cool.
actually see what I originally wrote, although there are a few sentences I admittedly redacted, including references to individual people who still, I'm sure, exist somewhere.
Yeah, definitely.
Some
One of them,
It's
when I
very
looked them up, was running a bagel joint somewhere.
Yeah.
I think it's also important as we're thinking about playing with time and posting, and I mean, there's been so much of this research and knowledge about how to handle this, but then also thinking about what happens after you die, right? And like what happens to these sites and having a plan for that. And I mean, there's so
Yeah.
many people in communities who then maintain websites for other people who pass because that's very important or meaningful or memory, or even like people who pre-write different kinds of posts that they want to have released on like anniversaries of things. And I mean, I think there's a piece of that around identity and really thinking about like your longer term impact. And like you can't always count on Facebook or whatever silo to actually still exist. And so
Yeah, but the after effects of somebody's account being alive on Facebook is sort of has not only been documented, but even personally with me, I keep getting friend requests from dead people, and it's somewhat disturbing to see that somebody who has passed wants to be your friend because Facebook has suggested it.
Oh yeah.
That's a good point.
yeah.
I had to report a dead person once because like people were saying happy birthday to that dead person,
Oh,
and it was so awkward.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I can't do that because their spouse deliberately didn't want to report it.
Yeah.
And wanted it
Yeah.
to stay up
Oh,
as if
as
they
a
were,
lie.
it makes them feel
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. People do that with like their children if they pass
Yep.
really early.
Oh.
I mean, it's totally a thing. But of course, the problem with Facebook is it could get shut down. And so if you want to have these memorialized sites for other people or even planned for yourself, like I think having your own site and having that capability is very attractive.
Has anybody set their site into a digital trust so that it'll just keep going until they?
No.
As far as like registration and
No, as
hosting,
well,
or
basically leaving sufficient money around that it could run for like 20 or 30 years, or instructing family members to make sure it gets kept up. I've never done.
isn't
the
that
actual legwork.
tricky? Like there are rules and penalties for trying to control like domain registration for very long periods of time, right?
No, I'm saying.
Are you just leaving money and
let's
then?
say, let's say I come to the river here and say, in the event of my death, would you be willing? I'll put aside some money. Would you be willing to handle this and make sure for the next 20 or 30 years that this website stays up? And he says hypothetically, fine. I'll be your administrator or whatever you're calling it. And
Shouldn't we
yeah.
do that kind of thing? I mean,
No, I'm saying we probably
I think
should,
that's
but how many
good.
people,
Actually,
it's the same thing.
like even
How
just
many
graceful
people-
parting.
Not living wills, I mean.
Well, not even just living wills.
Yeah.
I was at Costco and they were selling caskets,
Yeah.
and I said to myself,
What?
yeah. I said to myself, who's buying their casket in advance, and what are they doing with it? Because, people don't plan these things because people.
Do they have
Don't
like
really.
100 caskets like bundled together?
Well, this
Sorry.
is Costco in Florida. I've never seen it at Costco in New York.
Well, there's certain
Space-
assumptions
yeah.
if you live in Florida.
It's true.
There's
But
a
what do it's what do you do with your casket until you're ready to use it if you buy it in advance?
You store all
Coffee
your
table.
other Costco stuff. You put your soap and your big box of cereal in it. It's a big storage bin.
Sleep in it, obviously.
But
You
it's
put
sort
some
of
meat
the point.
lockers in it.
Nobody thinks about this sort of stuff. There are people who have had health scares often do, but
Yeah.
people who don't anticipate anything happening don't think about bad things happening.
Yeah, and nobody. Okay,
Right,
I
feel like
doubt
we're
that
gonna just
anybody
reel it in
has
back to
their
our list.
stuff.
That's what I was about.
Oh,
to
I
sorry.
brought this up. I brought this
Right.
up.
That's what I was
Costco
about to say.
casket.
I have one link to add.
Yes.
On the wiki we have longevity, and it has several articles, and it has some brainstorming on like a dead man switch. So like how to transition your domain, but only after you die. And also there's also an IndieWeb Trust section.
Oh,
So of our list of topics, and then I have one that I want to add, but I wanted to go back to Derek's topics about thinking about what is the style and how is visual design communicating who you are and how do you present yourself. So I'm completely erasing all of our discussion about death and refocusing us very awkwardly
On life.
back to life. Or perhaps maybe your style changes after you pass. I don't know. Derek, you had brought this up. I don't know if you had thoughts immediately you wanted to throw in, or
So while you guys were talking, I was looking for this post that Marty documented. It was a post from one of our past IndieWeb meetups, and he posted a website of this guy's personal website, and like each different page had a different style to it, and I just thought that was so cool.
Was it Jason Santa
I
Maria?
can't remember what that site's, huh?
Jason Santa Maria
Is it
did
Jason?
that for a while.
I'm not sure.
It
What?
might be under the custom post styles page too,
I
or
think-
something like that.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if like Marty shared it after like a summit, maybe, as an example of something that was there that was really cool.
he was.
Trent Walton does
Those
it
things, they all
too.
blend together after a while.
Trent Walton.
The summit was in Portland?
Yes.
Yes, he went to Portland.
Yeah,
I think he was there.
yeah, he was.
Yeah, it was really. I know exactly what you're talking about. I can try to find it if you want to just.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, like that was pretty much like what all I had to say. I mean, like other than that, like so like style specifically, like I want to like get a specific
Yeah,
style
it
for
is
my
Jason Santa Maria.
yeah, but specific.
But it's his old one, his old V. Sorry,
Style
Yeah, it's
from
it's
my-
archived.
Yes.
on my page.
V4.
It's on custom post style on the wiki.
Okay.
I think this might have been
Oh, he might have changed it. I'm not sure.
it. I think this might have been it. Yeah, I can keep digging.
Yeah. So yeah, like I wanted like to find like a specific style for like my home page and like kind of like match that style up with like each of my like social media profiles so I can like create a brand for myself. And I kind of do that now with like having like a standard like a profile picture for like all of my social media profiles and just like the way I talk, you know. I want to make sure I convey that. I always want to try to be like authentic and true to myself. I want to try to like talk proper or whatever, and like social media. But yeah, I mean that's pretty much all I have to say about that. Just like when it comes to style.
Well, I think that it's really interesting is how do you then figure out, like, how do you match visual design to identity? And especially if you're someone who maybe doesn't have a lot of training in color theory, typography, and layout, you're picking from a set of pre-existing beats, right? And so how do you figure out which one of those has the right kind of sense that this matches who you are, who you want to be, and what you show? And I think that's really hard, and I think there is kind of this challenge too about how do you then train people so they can have the power to be more expressive. You mentioned CSS Grid earlier, and I've been learning like a little bit about that, and I think the flexibility of that is really exciting in that it's relatively simpler than some other layout tools. And so I think that's really exciting in the world of people being able to have layouts and be creative and not be as constrained by kind of like the
Yeah.
box designs that we see that are so standard.
Like you don't want your site to be looking like bootstrappy, as they call it.
Yeah.
Cool thing is you do it really a long time ago and you just don't touch it and you wait for the cycle of
And
design to come back around. So I'm almost there. So if I hold out a couple more years, I think I won't.
Well, we're in the 90s nostalgia
The
period.
90s nostalgia. My site's like my site's like 800 pixels wide, which used to be like
No, I'm saying a few years
perfect
ago,
for
we were in the
desktop, and
80s
now it's like
nostalgia.
almost right for a phone.
In a
Without
few
having
more
been
years,
sponsored.
you'll get into the 2000s. It's usually what, about a 20-year cycle? People start.
Yeah,
getting
it's like 10 or
nostalgia back
15.
about 20 years.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool! Glossy buttons are back.
It's a really interesting idea though. It's like how do you it's two things like the comfort, like how do you express yourself if you have a desire to express yourself visually on your site but you don't have the tools or the design skills, like how can you then tap into like easy training or easy tools? Like CSS Grid's fantastic for that, I think, but like how can you give people the agency to be able to like, hey, I want to express this part of my identity visually, how can I then do that? Yeah.
think probably a good way. I mean, like just to basically get an idea, it's like to look at your clothing, like what colors do you see in your clothing, like your wardrobe.
Question.
You know, like
Like
I wear
10 minutes.
I wear a ton of gray. My profile picture is gray. I like blue. Sometimes I like green. You see green on my website. So things like that.
To like help develop a color palette
Yeah,
based on
yeah.
like what you wear. Yeah.
Like it almost comes back to David's question of, well, who am I? Right? Like I'm creating this website that's all about me, but do I know enough about who I am or how to define it in these ways that the internet expects?
Or do you formulate a personality
Right.
ahead
Right.
of behaving?
Right.
Right.
Or,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Or maybe you're
Or
just
is it-
bootstrapped. Like that's just who you are. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's really
That's an
interesting.
interesting thought. You create your website on the person you want to be, and then try to become that person.
Right. Yeah.
That's a thing.
That idea never occurred to me.
Aspirational.
Yeah.
Aspirational.
And that brings me to the point that, and I think this actually transitions really nicely to like another piece of identity as a tool that we have on our websites that's coming about is the H cards. And I personally am really excited about that as a standard and having that be so flexible where people can put in the demographic. And so it's a piece on your website that has like your demographics. But it seems to me as though it's very open in terms of what kinds of demographics you want
Anybody
to
ever shown you
relate.
some of the more detailed ones?
We saw a few of them earlier, and I think like especially like that's a great epitome of identity. And so some people are able to really synthesize it into words or images and kind of like tags and categories. I think like the flexibility of that is great because it's so much more than the silos offer. But I think it's interesting. One discussion I'd really love to have here is around people putting pronouns in their H cards. And I've seen, and so I've actually pulled up on the Microformats blog a discussion around that and people kind of thinking about that. And I mean, it kind of ties into this larger discussion that I think a lot of people are having about how much they should be putting forward pronouns as a way of normalizing that as classic demographic information or making communication easier. Gregor, I see that on the blog you were mentioned from this, and Marty and I have been talking about this a lot, and so I'd be interested in your thoughts or other people's thoughts too around really any of the issues around designing an H card. Should there be standards, or how do you show stuff?
Sorry, my brain is.
So
I'm hitting
not
that
enough
afternoon.
Donut holes in
Yeah.
microwave coffee.
I didn't get more coffee. I need to. Well, there's kind of two aspects to it. So I mean, H card, as far as microformats are concerned, you can really mark up. Yeah, you can mark up anything. We've kind of standardized the most common ones. You know, name. There's a whole slew of them. You know, name, address, information. But technically, you're basically just giving parsers a way to pull something out. So if you want to add something new that's not used elsewhere in H card, you're totally free to do that. And with pronoun is pretty new. The microformats wiki actually did define how to do that, and most of us that have implemented it have done it that way. But Martijn actually, he did it a different way. He documented on his wiki. I don't remember exactly what it was.
Complex, as I recall.
It was complex, but it was. I mean,
Specific, but that's what I'm saying. It was
I think it conveys it better. Yeah.
The post.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. So, I definitely, as far as like general usage of pronouns, I definitely agree that it's something that we should do to normalize the usage and just get the concept put out. So.
I'm just disappointed Ben Roberts no longer has the unlisted as his lordship, which he did for a while. I just wanted to check. He did well.
I don't know if people had other thoughts.
Yeah.
I was excited to see that, like Marty casually was like, "Oh, you should make an H card and have pronouns in it." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And so it's exciting to see that there's discussions around this. I don't know if others have seen things about this or have thoughts or have done this or.
Well, there are a few I've contemplated. based on what other people are putting in. Do I want my birthday in my age card?
Mm.
I'm not talking about the year because you put too much information in, then identity thieves. But do you want to put your date? Because look at all of these sites where the one day of a year people seem to want to talk to you on any social media silo is when it says it's your birthday. So do I? And I think it's Aaron who has his website with like a balloon or something up there.
Yeah.
That only displays one day a year.
You do that too, don't you? Or was that for an anniversary?
For New Year's Eve, it
Okay.
does confetti.
All
Yeah,
right.
and then
But things like that can be fun.
Your death day, your anticipated death day,
I-
according
I'm
to,
not-
you
I'm
know,
not
psychic you
anticipating
see.
it.
Right time. Like right time.
If it happens, it happens.
Yeah.
Or wait.
Yeah.
No,
a
we.
way to
Yeah,
make
yeah.
that change, like just different day.
It's your
like, just
website.
random.
The
So
death-
then you're surprised.
Or just do it all the time.
The Google Doodle type? That would be interesting though, if anybody did the equivalent of the doodle. I don't know how you would get that many of them. but it would be-
Have other people do it.
It's like the
Well, even
doomsday
Google
clock,
ori-
right? Is
even
your death
Google
clock.
originally didn't do it as many days as they do now.
Right.
Yes, today on the website, we're celebrating the 345th birthday of somebody who's now old. But a random historical figure. That would be interesting if my website popped that up.
Yeah, Matt,
I can pull it
have
from
a thought?
Wikipedia.
I have a question for those who have been engaging in IndieWeb for a longer period of time. Have any of you reevaluated whether your tools express you and changed how you do things across the entire system, or not really?
Well, I use brackets, which as my editor. I mean, I guess you could consider that a tool. And one of the things, I mean, you can pretty much do this with almost any editor, but like one of the things I love about brackets is that you can really customize it as much as you want. So I have like the text on my screen is like it's like a neon color, and like when I type, confetti comes out of the cursor. So that helps me. That actually helps me like stay focused because like I really have a hard time staying focused. And, like I just love seeing like glowing letters on my screen.
But after you set that up, does it remain useful to you? And wait, is any of that expressed to the public readers, or only no? Okay.
Yeah.
But would it, like, have you recognized that you're not expressing yourself and want to do it differently?
I mean, every day I look at my website and think, I should probably do this better. Constantly like that. Like I should update my website to explain more of who I am and what I'm doing now.
But is that because you don't want to do it or you're just procrastinating? Is it-
Oh, I have this grand idea which I've been working on for 15 years.
Yeah, so back to, if you want to do something, you are just procrastinating on it.
Will your
Like
site
most of us are doing.
express you properly when you complete your crazy, your bold
My bold
plan?
idea.
Or does
Because
it
by the time
already
I get it
express
done,
you?
it'll be out of date and I'll need to come up with another bold idea.
I mean, I think something that's interesting is like who we are, and we kind of talked about this earlier, changes and adapts like as time goes on, you know. And so like one thing I noticed like about a year ago, I got involved in the IndieWeb, and one of the main things I wanted to do was track my reading. However, over the last year, I started reading a whole lot less. So now if you look at the site, the primary thing you see is TV shows and podcasts. And
So you need to go back in time and document that stuff you did before you got distracted anyway.
Exactly. No, so I mean, I've started reading again, but it was just the era context. Like I had a lot of life change in the last year, and so I was reading for a lot of the things that I was working on, the projects I was working on last year around this time. And with that transition of life, like what time I'm investing in things has changed, and so it's interesting to see like. And obviously, my website's only kind of existed for the last year. But as the years go forward, I'll be able to look back and be like, well, what was my focus like in 2017? What was my focus in 2018 when I'm in 2020?
So the fact that you built and tweaked the tools was reflecting properly how you're behaving up until that time, but then you were distracted.
That's really interesting.
That seems real.
So we're officially at 2:55. So I think we've solved it, right?
No
Yeah.
more, no more identity questions.
That's right.
But I think we have 10 minutes before the next session starts, so we can totally continue our conversation.
Excellent.
Look at all of our web pages through the Internet Archive and see who we used to be
Oh, I have copies of all my websites from the Internet Archive.
And
I
the
really wish my
Okay.
interactive
GeoCities site was
transcripts
better archived.
can be here.
Can be here.
Can be here at
Oh, we'll be.
305.
Oh, that's you.
on this side. Yeah.
Now I have to leave the room.
What is that one about?
Audio
It's the ways of working with time-based media, and in
Can we talk
IndieWeb.
about death again?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm in.
Why do you like talking about that? Just asking.
That's
I'm
great.
just a very morbid person. You just don't know
Very
me very
forward.
well.
You're very
I just
forward
read it today.
thinking.
What?
You're forward.
I'm forward thinking. I'm a planner.
So forward thinking.
That's great. So go to Costco, buy the casket.
Yeah.
And fill it with toilet paper.
So it was you that proposed the nuclear holocaust, surviving the nuclear holocaust session, right?
Would. There's actually, it's not called Survivor magazine, but it was something very similar.
Prepper.
Prepper?
What?
The Doomsday Prepper magazines. Yeah.
It's impressive.
Okay. Well. Okay. So there are in the world of podcasting, right? So now,
We're not
fictional
starting your
podcasting.
section.
I know.
This is just,
I'm giving you an
elevator
opportunity to talk about death.
Uh-huh.
But so there's audio journalism, and people are they like archives and experiencing things and examining them and talking about them. And typically in a podcast, somebody's curating or presenting this to you. But in the fictional pieces, particularly the ones veering on horror and science fiction, you can have that same structure, only the characters can die in it. And and then at a certain point, the archive that you're hearing and the curation of that archive, it's presented as the whole experience being the past. So then the whole thing is basically just catching you up to death. So it's like a blog series you're posting out of order. Anyway, so you can talk with time-based media about death in very interesting
Catching you
ways.
up to death.
Yeah, it's a good one-liner at the catching up to death. It's like a subtitle of your subheading.
Excellent.
Catching
Adding it.
up to death.
Maybe.
Starting to depress right
Man. Yeah, that's really interesting.
I really had never thought about some of the digital legacy stuff you guys were talking about.
Yeah.
Not at all.
Did you guys talk about there's this company that takes a bot, like scrapes your Twitter feed, and from that it creates your an AI of yourself after you die.
Wow.
Really?
It is you.
Wait, is that a science fiction concept or is there a service?
It's a thing.
It's an actual thing.
Real,
Is
what's
it expensive?
called?
Something on
I
Black
forget
Mirror.
what it's called, but
We did that too. It turns out the math just isn't that hard.
Wow. That's,
Yeah.
Right.
Ghostwriter. New
Ghost
app to
Rider?
keep you tweeting after death.
yep.
Ghost Rider?
Well, it's
Writer,
probably not that
not
hard.
Writer.
Oh, I was gonna say,
You know,
like, is it like
in
tweet
ways
is like a
that are
bad
difficult
Nick
to
Cage
look at.
movie or something?
Like your
It drives
pros,
your car
like
after you die.
there are all those tools to
Ghost Rider, the
quantify,
PBS show back in the
I love that.
personality in prose style. And like you can tell statistically and quantifiably if somebody is depressed from monitoring their social media, and not
weird.
from the markers of like I'm depressed,
Oh yeah.
which is
Sticking to the theme of death, there's a site called thetweethereafter.com, which posts the person's last tweet
Oh my god.
wow.
and when they died. I guess I don't know how they figure out when they died.
Jeez.
But that's like totally the kind of thing like people would want to pre-write.
It says the reason
That's-
that they helicopter crash on
yeah,
Well, so like there's
Right?
Tom Petty.
getting ready to
God.
head
There's, like,
out on an
there's
exciting
famous people.
vacation.
Right.
That's it.
Really looking forward to this date. They might be the one.
There are a lot of helicopter crashes on here.
Probably post about it in the news a lot.
I can't find
You can even filter it by it.
That's
So you can
forced by a
oh
bull?
no.
I'm sorry.
It's crazy. And then, it'll create,
I told John I was not.
Texting
I didn't think the volcano was safe,
text,
but he's talked me down. We're gonna go.
Oh,
That sounds like
I
an
don't
episode
know.
of Black
I remember hearing
No.
someone who was
No, it's actually
gonna
real.
do something.
We know.
That definitely sounds like an episode of Black Mirror.
Well,
Next
that's why we waited.
session.
We're having a special, like,
micro session.
a pending session about various death
Talking about the weather.
discussions.
Excellent. Enjoy your micro session on death. Ponder death at least once a day.
Speaking of death.
In here, led by Matt Griffin, we have the text to audio and video, the kind of like interactive transcript session, talking about interesting ways of excerpting or linking into longer forms of video and audio using text transcripts. On this side, we have
And
Please
video.
Develop WordPress IndieWeb plugins. Yes, Please Develop WordPress IndieWeb plugins. I'm lonely. Led by David Chansky, who develops lots of IndieWeb WordPress plugins.
Where's the bathroom again?
The bathroom is through the kitchen, and then come out the other side. It's on your right. We got 5 minutes for restroom. Everybody up and stretch your legs, and then make your way.
What is this? What is this, gym class?
No, it's improv
Actually,
class.
yes. Everyone stand up together. Take a breath out. Let it out. And then take a deep breath in to a count of 4.
Is the hands
Hold it for
optional?
2, and let it out. All right. Now enjoy your break. Come on back.
We did it.
We'll be starting at 2:05. That's not right. That's a different time. 3:05.
And this is a hope I